Welcome to the webinar discussion today entitled Ending Gender-Based Violence in the World of Work, New Insights and Tools from Convention 190. As many of you may know, that the International Labor Organization had adopted in 2019 the Convention 190 on violence and harassment and its accompanying recommendation 206. The global community has made clear that violence and harassment has no place in today's world of work. Currently, there are 11 countries that have ratified the convention and many others in the process to follow suit. We will discuss the issues of what is happening with the convention in terms of the tools that have been developed and the guides that have been developed. There are a number of them available from the ILO, but more importantly, hearing from people on the ground, our amazing guests who are joining us today to speak about what they're doing, the issues that they're following, the concerns that they have, and looking at the road forward. I would encourage everyone subsequent to this call to please go to the ILO website to look at the digital interactive guide on the convention itself. My name is Kevin Cassidy. I'm the director of the ILO office for the United States and Canada. And without further ado, I would like to turn over the moderation to Casey Wagner. Casey, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Casey Wagner, and I'm an organizer, labor educator, and director of the Equity at Work initiative at Cornell's ILR School in New York City. I will be your moderator for today, and I am particularly excited to join you and the panelists for this amazing discussion. Today's webinar, Ending Gender-Based Violence in the World of Work, New Insights and Tools from Convention 190, explores how the International Labor Organization's groundbreaking labor standard on violence and harassment can support and deepen efforts in the US to address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. Where are we? Where do we need to go? How do we accomplish the cultural shift necessary to make lasting progress on this critical issue? What are the insights from C190 that can help us get there? Our speakers today all have long histories of activism and leadership on gender-based violence and harassment. Our audience members come from many communities, including unions, employers, civil society, government, academia, and philanthropy. We want to harness that interest and commitment way beyond the four corners of this webinar to spur greater action and working together on many fronts. And at the end of this session, we'll explore your ideas on how to do that. But let me set the stage first with a few key concepts. Gender-based violence and harassment, GBVH, the acronym, is defined as violence and harassment directed at people because of their sex or gender. Rooted in discriminatory gender norms, institutions, and laws, and buttressed by a lack of accountability for perpetrators, GBVH occurs in all societies as a means of control, subjugation, and exploitation that reflects and reinforces gender inequality. Buoyed by the resurgence of the Me Too movement, shout out to our dear sister Tarana Burke, founder in 2006, and buoyed by the Me Too movement in the late 2017s, and with the support of the American Bar Association's policy adopted in 2018, the International Labor Organization in June of 2019 adopted Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 concerning the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work, including gender-based violence and harassment. ILO's Convention 190 is the first binding international labor standards to comprehensively address these issues in the workplace. Negotiated by governments, employers, and worker organizations, ILO C190 is the manifestation of mutual interest and collective action through which social dialogue to prevent and address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. As a result, C190 provides key guidance for these constituencies in the US as they continue to grapple with unacceptable high rates of all forms of gender-based violence and harassment, including sexual harassment in the world of work. In recent years, efforts have focused on preventing these abuses by focusing on culture change and individual and institutional responsibility, recognizing that when workers who disproportionately experience gender-based violence and harassment, the process of change, they develop the most effective interventions. At the same time, the USG is providing critical leadership to prevent and address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, recognizing that it is a primary barrier to gender equity and equality. Today, we have a unique opportunity to hear from the ILO, USG leaders, activists, and audience members as we work together with the best tools that we have to address gender-based violence and harassment. This is just the beginning. We will continue. So let's get started. Meanwhile, I'm going to encourage all of you to use the Q&A function to ask questions. We'll use those to kick off our Q&A session at the end, and we encourage any and all questions, and we're keen to hear your thoughts for next steps. It is my great pleasure to welcome Chidi King, head of the Gender Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion branch at the ILO. Chidi is uniquely qualified to kick off our discussion today. As an official at the International Trade Union Confederation during the multi-year period when C190 was debated by members of the International Labor Conference, Chidi was a key leader in making sure that negotiations among governments and workers and employers organizations produced the strongest text possible. Now, as head of the ILO branch in charge of promoting the convention, Chidi leads the efforts for ratification and implementation of this groundbreaking labor standard. Chidi, I'll start with a broad question. Why is C190 so important? What are some of the key concepts in C90 for the United States?
Thank you so much, Casey. My warm greetings to everybody, both on the panel and in the audience today, and my very sincere apologies for showing up a little bit late, but showing up nonetheless for this absolutely critical and important webinar. In terms of why C190 is so important, I think you covered so much of that in your excellent introduction. This was the first time in 2019 when this was adopted by all three of the ILO's constituents, so the governments, the employers, and the workers, that the world basically recognized that everybody has the right to work free from violence and harassment. And it's quite incredible that it took us until 2019 to get to the stage where we're pronouncing that everybody in the world of work has the right to expect an environment that is free of violence and harassment. So this was hugely significant. And not just symbolic. I mean, it was hugely significant in recognizing and conferring that right. It's also quite an innovative standard, and this is another reason why Convention 190 is so important. It takes a very broad view of the world of work. It recognizes that in dealing with issues relating to violence and harassment, the starting point is not necessarily the world of work alone, that we have to recognize that there are issues that play out in society that feed into the world of work and feed into, the existence and the persistence of violence in our world of work. So those gender norms, the stereotypes, the expectations that we have of the different roles and women and men, and, those who do not conform to these binary notions of gender also experience. So extremely important. And of course, we know, as you mentioned, that it was adopted right in the midst of the, resurgence of hashtag #MeToo, with the revelations that came out of Hollywood in this instance, and the sort of sexual harassment and violence that workers in quite privileged positions compared to many workers were experiencing. So we have for the first time this recognition of violence and harassment. We have for the first time a universal definition of what violence and harassment is, what it looks like in the context of the world of work. We have it defined in relation to the impact it has on the victim, not necessarily of the intention of the perpetrator. Um, we have it include threats of unacceptable behaviors and practices. So not just the commission of unacceptable behaviors or putting in place unacceptable practice, but the threat of those. We have it defined in relation to not just physical violence, but also psychological violence, sexual harassment. And whilst it doesn't give specifics, we can anticipate that this includes things such as bullying, things such as, isolating workers, and so on. We have also for the first time a definition of what gender-based violence and harassment looks like in the world of work. We know that it includes sexual harassment, and we know now that it's defined according to a disproportionate impact that it might have on certain workers because of their sex or indeed because of their gender. It's really targeted at changing, the way that our workplaces operate, the environment of our workplaces, to introduce back these notions of respect and dignity. So this broad cultural change that is needed. And it's really important that it focuses not only on changing behaviors, defining that certain behaviors, saying that certain behaviors are simply not acceptable in the context of decent work and dignified workplaces, but certain practices are also not acceptable in the context of decent working environments and workplaces. So we can imagine, for instance, that working practices that put undue and unjustifiable psychological pressures on workers, unreasonable production times, for instance, might fall into what we understand to be violence and harassment. I think that's an important thing to remember. It recognizes the importance of power relations as well. And this is, of course, also particularly important when it comes to gender-based violence and harassment. So it recognizes that unequal power relations that exist in our societies very often between women and men, that the unequal power relations that also exist in the workplace between employer and worker can contribute to experiences of violence and harassment. It recognizes that certain groups are more vulnerable to experiences of violence and harassment, even if nobody is immune to this experience, unfortunately. But it recognizes the fact that the existence of discrimination and inequality really do feed into people's experiences of violence and harassment. So it requires particular action to be taken to give additional protection to vulnerable groups and to introducing measures to promote equality and non-discrimination. Everybody has the protection of the instrument as well, and I think that's critical.
What is in your work at the ILO, you've seen and supported numerous efforts around the world to use C190 as a tool to address gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace. What are some examples that you think might have the most resonance or relevance in the US based on your fabulous framework that you've just provided us?
Thank you. I mean, that's a tough question to ask because there are quite a number of examples, but I think the approaches that are more relevant would come back to looking at how C190 does deal with the world of work. So not looking at, just the workplace. We have seen, for instance, where countries are looking to take forward, C190, where unions and employers may be using it as a basis for collective bargaining and for collective agreements, this broader notion of what the world of work is. So, for instance, putting in place prevent the risk of violence and harassment arising on a commute to and from work. In the context of the US, this might be, well, what are working arrangements in, for instance, highly feminized workplaces where women may have to do night shifts or have to work in isolation? What are the transport, requirements that may be needed to minimize the risk of women being exposed to violence and harassment when going to and from work in those circumstances? Is it, better lighting in car parks? Is it, dedicated transport systems? Is it making sure that, workers are not traveling alone or walking alone across, dark areas, but in numbers? Is it rearranging shifts, to reduce, again, the risks of violence and harassment? So we've seen quite a lot of that innovative thinking going on. I know others will speak to some of the innovative work that's been happening in the US as well, but even things such as, introducing panic buttons for workers working, in the hotel and hospitality industry. Again, making sure that, workers who are having to go into hotel rooms, especially women workers having to go into hotel rooms, are not doing so alone when the room is occupied, especially if the room is occupied, for example, by a male guest. And some of the innovative thinking that we've been seeing is, yes, how do we make sure that those who are outside of the traditional workplace are also covered by this convention? In the context of the US, I may point to perhaps some interesting examples of trying to reach migrant workers. So we might look at migrant workers in seasonal agriculture, so again, the convention talks about protecting everyone irrespective of contractual status. So what does that actually mean in reality when you have a very fluid workforce? And where there might be issues, again, surrounding, the status of that workforce. Convention is quite clear that it's, it covers everybody, whether that you are documented or undocumented as a migrant, you have the right to be free of violence and harassment. Whether you're a seasonal or permanent worker, you have the right to be free of violence and harassment. So the dialogue to ensure those mechanisms, I think, is crucial.
Thank you so much, and particularly your comment about the different types of workplace, including domestic workers, as you were mentioning, migrant workers, and the different manifestations of what that workplace looks like. So thank you so much for framing the discussion today with your insights. So appreciate that.
Pleasure, Casey.
Thank you. I would like to turn to the US now. It is my great pleasure to introduce two leaders in the Biden-Harris administration with strong track records on addressing gender-based violence. Rosie Hidalgo, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Advisor on Gender-Based Violence at the White House Gender Policy Council, and Wendy Chun-Hoon, Director of the Women's Bureau at the US Department of Labor. Ending gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work is a priority for the Biden administration. Can you provide some examples of initiatives the administration is taking, particularly to support action at the national, local, and state levels?
Great. Well, thank you so very much for this invitation to be with all of you today, and really just commending the tremendous accomplishments that have occurred, as you all mentioned, by people coming together, government and employers, workers, and just society as a whole, to really put out this just critical statement, as we have said, that everyone has a right to work free from violence or abuse, or even the threats of violence or abuse. And as you have said, for the Biden-Harris administration, it is a very high priority. In fact, just yesterday, International Women's Day, we were commemorating the one-year anniversary of President Biden signing an executive order on March 8, 2021, creating for the very first time ever a White House Gender Policy Council that has not existed in the past. And this council operates in parallel, for example, with the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, the National Security Council. And really our mandate is to work across all of federal government, and every cabinet member, every federal agency has senior designees to this council, including Wendy, who's a wonderful representative from the Department of Labor. And as we all come together to really advance a whole of government commitment to addressing and advancing gender equity and equality. So the executive order called on this administration to develop our first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality. So I commend it to you all if you have not had a chance to see it. It was published in October of 2021 as a result of many stakeholder listening sessions that were held with civil society, as well as with the input across all the federal agencies. And you'll see that it highlights 10 key priority areas for advancing gender equity and equality. And certainly one of these is economic security, what a critical issue that is. But another one of these priority areas is ending gender-based violence, doing a lot more to prevent and improve the response and end gender-based violence. And obviously these 10 different priority areas, they really are interconnected. And they also, we're called to lift up, as has been mentioned, the need to do this work in a very intersectional manner as well, recognizing the different forms of oppression, whether it is based on sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, immigration status, disability. So really working holistically, not thinking there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but very intentionally lifting up those recommendations. So right now, all of the different federal agencies are working on their implementation plans. And I'm going to say one more quick thing there before I turn over to Wendy, that another important aspect of that executive order is it does call us to also develop for the first time ever in the U.S. a national action plan on ending gender-based violence. So as you may know, for President Biden, this has been a lifelong commitment. One of his greatest legislative accomplishments, of which he takes great pride as a senator, was to author and champion the first ever Violence Against Women Act here in the United States in 1994. And I am happy as we gather today to share the great news that legislation, bipartisan legislation to renew and to strengthen the Violence Against Women Act that was introduced in the Senate last month, we just got word today, will be moving forward as part of the omnibus bill that was introduced today. So we are hoping within a couple days it will come to the president's desk for his signature. But just as we recognize how important the Violence Against Women Act is, and every time it's up for reauthorization, we don't just reauthorize it. We say, where has progress been made, but where do we still see gaps and barriers and opportunities to continue to provide much bigger range of options for survivors to work towards their safety, healing, well-being, and justice. And that is why the president called on us to develop this national action plan on gender-based violence. And we know that more than 75 countries around the world have national action plans on GBV. So it's been a great opportunity to learn with humility and learn about the great experiences of other countries. We've had consultations, for example, with South Africa, with Argentina, with Australia, many other countries. And as we're developing this national action plan on gender-based violence, there's going to be a pillar specific to economic security. We've been hearing so much in all our listening sessions with civil society that that is a critical element, as we all know, both to prevent the high levels of risk of gender-based violence, but also to better respond and lead to well-being, is to also address these critical issues of economic security and also housing and other issues that intersect. So I'll say more about that later, but we're very excited that there is such a commitment on the part of the Biden-Harris administration to really move forward, both domestically and globally, in advancing these goals.
Wendy Chun-Hoon, in your role as a director of the Women's Bureau as the Department of Labor, how does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I thank you, Casey and Rosie. So good to be in conversation today, and just really important and also invigorating. So, Rosie emphatically said ensuring a safe working environment is a cornerstone for the administration. And that's absolutely true and always has been at the Women's Bureau, the Department of Labor. So we hold very central the connection between the safety and security that women and non-binary folks and all workers who, are marginalized because of their identities or their working conditions and their loved ones' economic security and humanity. And we hold those both at the same time and very central to the work. The Women's Bureau, I always think about superpowers of the Women's Bureau, and one of them is, data, making sure that we're accounting for what the challenges are, what the injustices are. Another one is stakeholder engagement. We have regional offices all across the country, and we use those outposts to maintain accountability to the community that we serve. And the third one is the one where I want to kind of dig in deep here. We have a grant making authority. And so we do a lot of innovation through grant making. And one of those grant programs, both of them actually, I should say, are being very purposeful about addressing gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. One of them is our Women in Apprenticeship and Non-Traditional Occupations, or WANTO grant program. And the whole point of WANTO is to really expand the pathways for women to enter into what are still very male-dominated sectors in our economy. So this is where women are less than 25% of the workforce. And these are often the jobs that pay really well, and they're good quality jobs. And so almost to a T, the grantee partners in the WANTO program have provided employers with training on sexual harassment prevention, resources in this area. They've also set up support networks and mentoring programs to really support women when they are experiencing harassment and bullying or discrimination on the job. So that's an important cornerstone for the Women's Bureau and for the work that the Department of Labor is doing now. A second grants program is our Fostering Access, Rights, and Equity grant program, and really focused on workers who are most marginalized, underserved, earning low wages, and to know about their employment rights and to know about protections that they do have on the job. One of our grantee partners in that space is actually the Women's Bureau, or Bureau of Women Affairs in Guam. They are working right now to educate hundreds of women workers about workplace harassment, informing them about their rights, providing access to benefits and resources. So just keeping this priority very forefront in some of the grant making and innovation that we're able to do.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Rosie. We've heard today about some key concepts in ILO C190 relevant to the US. How do you see 190 creating openings for the administration and its partners to address gender-based violence? And I just want to mention that we do have closed captioning available for folks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Yes. As I mentioned with regard to our national gender strategy, it specifically calls out this ILO convention. Even though it's sort of a higher 30,000-foot level blueprint of moving forward, we were very excited that the language specifically says that the U.S. government welcomes the adoption of the International Labor Organization Convention on Eliminating Violence and Harassment in the World of Work, enacted in the wake of the global Me Too movement to protect workers from harassment in the workplace. So the U.S. government is very much committed to all the different ways we can to advancing those goals. And I can give you a great example. Just last Thursday, the president, the vice president, bipartisan members of Congress, and many advocates and survivors came together here at the White House to sign critical legislation called Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act. So this is legislation that for over 5 years, people were working to try to advance. And this administration is very excited that this, for the first time now, makes it very clear that employees cannot be forced into arbitration, that they have a right to seek access to safety and justice. And I would love to just read real briefly the quote from Vice President Harris as we gathered last week to sign this. She said, "Forced arbitration silences survivors of sexual assault and harassment. It shields predators instead of holding them accountable, and gives corporations a powerful tool to hide abuse and misconduct." And then the president, as he signed the legislation, said, and I quote, "If a worker experiences sexual assault or harassment, it is in the employer's best interest to address it and to make sure it never happens again. Employers cannot successfully compete for the best workers if their workplace practices are unsafe and unjust." So we really see it as an opportunity to send these key messages and really for all of us to see how this can help also prevent, to really encourage in the workplace for people to do more, to proactively address these issues. And one way the federal government is doing this is that the president also signed an executive order to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the workforce, known as the DEIA-EO, alphabet soup here. But what it really does is it specifically calls out addressing and improving how we are preventing harassment, including sexual harassment, throughout the entirety of the federal government. The federal government is the largest employer in this country with over 2 million employees. All the agencies, of course, have their own policies and training and goals, but really what we have put out there is a national strategic plan calling on every federal agency to review their policies, their practices, their training, and to keep moving towards best practices and to be held accountable for that. So the president is very committed to really lifting this up, in the private sector, but also advancing in the government sector, what it means to really update our policies. And also when President Obama signed a presidential memorandum back in 2012, he called on all federal agencies to develop workplace policies to support federal employees who also may have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, maybe in the workplace, but outside the workplace, recognizing the impact it has in the workplace and the importance of workplace flexibility policies, supporting federal employees who are survivors. And the Office of Personnel Management had put out guidance for federal agencies in 2013 about that. So it was a commitment of the Obama-Biden administration, and we are renewing that once again. We are really, and we're working, and I'm happy to say that through the Violence Against Women Act, there is training for Futures Without Violence to serve as a national training and TA resource center. And that's specifically, they have a grant to have a Workplaces Respond resource center to address these issues and to better support survivors in every federal workplace. So they too are helping lift up promising practices, and just starting later this month, we're going to be doing a lot of additional training across federal agencies to help them revisit, renew, strengthen all these policies, practices, and commitments.
Thank you, Rosie, for creating that beautiful, forward-looking and exciting blueprint and lifting up the signing of no longer forced arbitration. Wendy, the C90 stresses the importance of building coalitions, including employer and worker organizations, government at all levels, and other advocates. How would you, in your role, like coalitions to grow? Because I know the Women's Bureau has been very key in being an amazing convener of usual and unusual suspects here.
Yeah, I mean, TD and Rosie both said this. I think the opportunity certainly centered in C190 and in this moment is really recognizing, for example, who was most vulnerable in the pandemic, and really understanding that because of our structures and conditions at work, they were at risk well before the pandemic, and that everybody has a role in addressing that. And gender, addressing gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work is central to that. So I think, I go back to the role that, for example, the Women's Bureau can play, because we're, somewhat uniquely positioned with outposts across the country to really engage all levels of civil society, employers, local governments, workers, folks who have been impacted by GBV, and really bring everybody into conversation. Unions, the role that unions can play, really thinking about, again, what Chidi said at the opening about who has power, what the power dynamic is, how do we address that head on, and specifically for workers who are in the lowest wage sectors, who are not in, who are the minority in terms of their workplace, and whether they see themselves there, and how vulnerable you feel when you don't see others like you in the same workplace. The emphasis that this administration has put on ensuring workers have more power to collectively organize and form unions, and what a role that can play. Also really, as I said before, centering in the data on what's happening, who is most vulnerable, and the kinds of interventions that we're talking about today, and whether they're effective, and really keeping an eye on that. Lifting up the work that's happening across the country in state and city-based leadership around important employment security provisions, whether it's paid leave or paid sick and safe days, importantly, and really thinking holistically, as Chidi was saying in the beginning, about what it takes to make sure that workers feel safe, secure, they're able to take care of their families, and that it's really a holistic approach.
Wendy, can you talk a little bit about the WANTO grants and how that resonates with some of the comments that Rosie made?
Yeah. So, WANTO has been a longstanding grant program, and I think what we've learned from it is how persistent some of these challenges are. So, what I'm thinking about right this moment is a lot of the conversation that we're having about supply chains and about what I think we see as frankly a good job shortage, and thinking about how we really address disruptions in the supply chain by thinking about the quality of the jobs that people are in, including whether people feel safe and secure. And so thinking about a program and investment like WANTO that is really very specifically organized by folks who have been most impacted in their experiences in this work and in entering non-traditional occupations, thinking with a laser focus about how do we bring equity into some of these jobs that are the growth sectors as we rebuild America's infrastructure, and thinking about the fact that they are good, higher paying jobs, and really attending to the power dynamics and the sometimes lack of protections, a lot of workplace culture issues that have to be overcome to make sure that these jobs are safe jobs and secure jobs for everyone. So really intentionally investing in those kinds of, bystander trainings, explicit policies that are proactive about addressing GBVH, and mentorship programs and network support, so that really that power dynamic starts to shift.
Thank you so much. In the last minute that we have, Rosie, and then I'll ask Wendy, any advice in continuing the momentum?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think what you listed up is so crucial. This work can only happen as coalition work, right? Bringing together front and center the voices of survivors and those most negatively impacted. For example, we saw how crucial that was to the Ending Forced Arbitration Act, was to really center the voices of survivors. But then the coalitions that need to happen across different advocacy groups and really continuing to work in a bipartisan way as well, to send a message that this impacts everyone, it impacts all of society, and we all need to be committed to this. And I think what we all have been saying as well is so crucial, that at the end of the day, it's about social norms change, and how do we continue advancing that, not to tolerate any forms of abuse and harassment. And so in the workplace as well, it means not waiting until it happens, but going upstream and sending a message that we need respectful, inclusive, safe environments that then everyone thrives and society as a whole benefits from that. So I think there's progress being made in that direction, but we all must continue from wherever we are to work collaboratively with these aspirations, both domestically and globally, to advance these goals.
Thank you, Rosie. Wendy?
Yeah, three things. Yep. I think we have to continue to visibilize what is happening and people's experience. It is, we have to understand that it's systemic, right? This is not personal. And in doing so, the only way we're going to get to sustainable solutions, the right solutions, are for centering those folks who are most marginalized. So really, really taking that approach to the work ahead, and knowing that there are hundreds of us on this conversation right now, so many out in the states and in communities who are ready and willing to do this work, and to have the federal government leadership from the top all the way down, employers, unions, community folks, folks that have been impacted, who are digging in deep on this conversation, means that we will get to that sustainable and bold solution.
Thank you, Rosie and Wendy, for your vision as how we move C190 forward in the United States. Thank you again for your amazing leadership. I'd like to now turn to a roundtable discussion among leaders and activists who have worked long and hard to address GBVH directed at workers in a variety of different occupations. It is my great pleasure to first introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to ask very specific questions to each of them. So Nikia Hunter, Cultural Change Liaison at the Oregon Tradeswomen and a union carpenter. I'd also like to introduce Tiffany Thompson, Director of Workforce Equity and Technical Assistant at Oregon Tradeswomen. Roshonda Williams, Unite Here, Local 1 in Chicago, the union that represents workers in the hospitality industry, such as housekeepers, and a leader in the hands-off, pants-on movement. Emily Dickens, Chief of Staff and Head of Government Affairs for the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, an organization that has led employer efforts to address gender-based violence and harassment. And Gabrielle Carteris, President of the Federation of International Artists and immediate past President of SAG-AFTRA, who has spearheaded the union drive to change the culture in the entertainment industry. So I would like to start with Nikia and Tiffany. Where have you made the greatest inroads in addressing gender-based violence in the construction industry? And what would you ask your co-panelists to help you deal with your greatest challenges?
Thank you so much for having us. We're really grateful to be here. So I would say I'm going to name one thing that we feel like we're having great inroads on, and then Nikia is going to name another piece that we're working on. So the first is folks talked a lot about collaboration and the need for that. So here in the Portland metro area, we have a project called Construction Career Pathways. And that is a project that is being led by a regional government, but with significant input from organizations like ours, Oregon Tradeswomen, other community-based organizations, other government agencies. And essentially what it is it's a policy framework that can be adopted by our local government agencies that has 7 key elements in it, with the goal of creating equity on construction jobs that are publicly owned. And so one of the key pieces, one of those key elements is having a culture change program on every single publicly owned construction site. And so when we talk about that, I want to give a shout out to pieces that Chidi said about what best practices are in this. And when we talk about culture change, we talk about focusing on changing individuals' behaviors. And that's the expectations that are outlined in that policy framework. So Oregon Tradeswomen is an affiliate of a culture change movement that we call Rise Up. And the goal of that is to deliver an advanced culture change. And it is a program that contractors can use on those publicly owned projects to be making sure that we're eliminating hazing, bullying, harassment, discrimination, all of these behaviors that everybody has been talking about, before me. And so I think that's really exciting because this is the first one of these sort of workforce focused policies for construction that has included an element of mandating culture change programming and not just a generalized, here's what our sexual harassment policy is. If I were to ask like my co-panelists and maybe even folks in the audience, like one of the biggest challenges that we have to overcome is reminding folks when you're doing construction projects, whether you are a public owner or if you're working at a nonprofit or if you own your own home, you have a huge role that you can play in determining what those job sites look like. Because as the owner of that project, in the same way you might say, hey, I want a bathtub in my new bathroom, you can also say, I expect for you to bring a diverse crew of workers and I expect for them to be treated well. And so that would be my biggest thing, is that please remember, you have so much power as a project owner to make a difference and to demand that things are better in construction. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nikia, who's going to just talk briefly a little bit more about Rise Up and culture change in particular.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My name is Nakia. Rise Up is a program that brings contractors tools to build a respectful workplace culture, from the business office to the stretch and flex floor. Standards are in place to show what a safe, inclusive job site looks like, to demonstrate the culture needed to build retention of workers, blueprints of what unity, teamwork, and respecting each other's differences while lifting each other up in execution of jobs well done looks like. But it also is having spaces created to be wrong, to mess up, to be green, and to be taught and showed how to maneuver safely through the challenges as well. Building teams that uplift each other in skill development as well as promotions. Making sure your team is set up for success takes every part of the team to participate. And we together can build a respectful workplace where all employees are treated fairly, where we acknowledge differences and build off of each other's strengths, valuing each other's input and building teams that can problem solve. Gender-based violence can end, but it will take all of us to be a part of that culture change. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. The collaboration, the community, the accountability, the dignity, the respect, and the interdependency that you have lifted up, and the responsibility for those who have power to make a difference are such crucial pieces of your experience. Rashonda, how do you react to that? And what can you share about your work that could have the most relevance for other industries, even though they may be very different?
Good morning. Thanks again for having me. And what I've come to understand is that gender-based violence and harassment feels the same way across sectors. It's demoralizing, it provokes anger, anxiety, and stress. It leads to missed time at work, low self-worth, powerlessness, and depression. What we decided to do is we decided to have conversations with many of our members. We did a survey, and we had lots of conversations about the information and the data that we received in the survey. And what we found out is that over 50% in some industries had been harassed by guests of the hotel. And that became our focus. We talked to everyone. Most of the conversations were discreet, and we grew our data one by one. And we learned that our industry had a high level of gender-based violence and harassment. In having our conversations, we decided that we needed to do something about it. And what we did was we created a room for having our policies changed. We went to our legislators. We had many conversations with our legislators. And one of the biggest challenges that we face is changing the conversation in the room. We enlisted some of our male union brothers to have these conversations with us. And we had to identify where the line was crossed with flirting, innocent flirting, and harassment. These are all of the conversations that we had to be a part of. And we had our male counterparts enlisted, those who were husbands, those who had daughters, those who were uncles, share in having those conversations with our industries. And that is where we were able to get legislation changed and get panic buttons so that women in our industry could feel safe in their workplace.
Thank you, Rashonda. The two components that you talked about, workers and government, and then the creation of the panic button that I assume had some employer engagement, is part of that beautiful social dialogue that really contributes to social change. And I want to thank you so much for that framework and that inspiration. I'd like to turn to Emily. Your organization has the ability to impact the work of hundreds of employers across the country. What have you found most effective in achieving culture change and not simply defending against allegations of sexual harassment? And where are your most successful collaborations been in your role at SHRM?
So thank you. So I'll say, first of all, I love that everyone's using the same language we talk about, culture. We talk about the fact that this is not just an issue for women. So I love hearing about the engagement of men in the workplace as we deal with these issues. SHRM's got 300,000 plus members who are HR professionals or those who are HR accountables in their organization. And we kind of look at those people as the culture cheerleader in the organization. They're the person to really keep everyone aware. But there are other partners internally who should be keeping everyone aware and monitoring accountability and creating a culture of safety. And we say culture is top down. So when you all say employers, 9 times out of 10, you are talking about the boss, that the boss has to be someone that sets the example for this and that shows you what that culture in an organization should be, who speaks to that culture often as they're addressing the organization and provides the resources. But we've found also the other people who really impact culture in the workplace, people managers. Your people managers are the ones that have the most direct impact on an individual's experience in the workplace. And where you have people managers who are either not aware, not committed to, or even part of the problem, you are losing people in the workplace. The cost to acquire new talent is astronomical. And you're losing money all the time because you don't have people managers that are trained. So what we found is, even though we're an association that focuses and society that focuses on human resource professionals, that human resource professionals aren't going to be able to do their job if people managers aren't creating the cultures to allow them to do their jobs. So we developed a people manager program. It made all the sense in the world, because as all of us here who've ever been an individual contributor, you're an individual contributor on Monday, on Wednesday, you are a people manager, right? And that's because of what you did as an individual contributor, but no one is training you how to address those soft needs, right? You know how to do the work, but how do you take care of those people who have to work with you and who you're responsible for in the workplace? And so I'd love more focus across the board as people are talking about these issues on the people manager relationship and making sure that as you are identifying talent to move into these new managerial roles, that you're also giving them the training. So that's the next piece I'll say, is investment in professional development on how to be a people manager, how to spot and talk to your employees when there are issues. You know, all of us aren't an open book, and we don't all have to be, but you can get to a point where you understand your people, where you know that there's an issue and that someone is not feeling safe in the workplace. And so our people manager certification, and it's a certificate actually, is really a short online training that will allow people managers to see all sorts of issues. And it's so pliable, as we recently had the issues 2 Augusts ago now, where we were talking more about diversity in the workplace and how people of color were treated. We were able to add components that focus on that. We've got components that focus on gender issues and bias. And so there's so many other pieces we can continue to add to that. But I would say that's the number one thing we need to think about in our cultures. So when people keep saying the employer, you can have a great employer that has put all the tools in place to create an environment and a culture that works for everyone. But if that is not trickled down to the people managers, it is going to be a problem. So that's the number one thing. Now, when we talk about government and getting government involved, you know, even our United States government, when we think about that, every office in there, every elected official, their office is really one business. They don't have one huge, chief human resources officer over Congress. And so what we've done is really educate them more about how they can run their offices based on culture, so that then when they're on the floor talking about federal issues like flexibility and workplace leave and paid leave, they have a better understanding because they're running these offices as the employer. And so I would say education is the number one key. Talking about this, but for sure, our job is to make sure we've got resources and toolkits so that people can understand how they can be better educated about these issues. And so those are our two focuses, really, on the people manager piece, on getting a culture that's top down. So 3 focuses: a culture that's top down, focusing on the people manager, and providing the resources needed so that you can create those cultures and monitor them.
Emily, thank you so much. And I really so appreciate the way in which you mapped out the terrain of the workplace and the accountability and roles that everyone can play, and also the importance of lifelong learning, continuing education, and keeping up with those contemporary issues. And so I really appreciate that framework. Thank you so much for that. Gabrielle, for several years, you have focused on shifting the culture within the entertainment industry. What are your greatest opportunities and challenges?
First of all, thank you for having me here. I can't believe we're still having this conversation, but I'm thrilled that we have such proactive people. I actually think our challenges are our opportunities. And I think that's really important for us. We've been challenged historically with the burden of things being this way for centuries. We see the slow pace of change. We have personal fears of repercussions. And I think one of our biggest challenges is the lack of really clear structure. So when you're hearing about C190 and the idea that you're working with employers, workers, and laws, I think that this is exactly the way that we've looked in terms of how we want to approach the work that we've been doing. Harvey Weinstein was an explosive moment. He created an opportunity, though, for us to have change. When it first came out and people started to talk about Harvey Weinstein, I kept saying, beyond making this a moment, we have to make it a movement. And to make it a movement, we have to have strong things in place. We all know what things are wrong or right, but we don't know how to approach them. And our members who spoke out really shared the vulnerabilities that were taking place within our industry. But I have to tell you, I work with the AFL-CIO, I do the work with FIA. This is something that is global, and you're right. So our first thing for us when the Harvey Weinstein incident occurred, we really looked at what can we do to make a difference. We created a code of conduct. That was important. It never existed within our organization. After we did that code of conduct, we made sure to disseminate it with our employers and with other people in the industry. We know that there's certain laws, as mentioned, that really there's a lot of gray area, hasn't been defined. And we also noticed that in our collective bargaining language that we wanted to have exist, but how did we get it in there? Because you have to get your employers to agree, not only to put it in, but to actually utilize it, right? It's only effective if we really all recognize it. So we created guidelines. And those guidelines talked about something that happens early on in the pipeline from our collective bargaining. Not all the work we do as an organization deals with just what happens in our collective bargaining. We don't have jurisdiction over the audition, but Harvey Weinstein, we saw it. He was an example of what was going on in hotel rooms and in private residence. So we created, with a conversation with other leaders in the industry and our employers, the idea that no auditions could take place within hotels or private residence. So you had to have the ability to have a personal person of choice that could come with you. And by creating those guidelines and getting agreement on it, it allowed us actually to go and put it into our collective bargaining the next time around in our major contracts and into our smaller contracts as well, because we established something early on to help us. And then where we found that where we don't have necessarily, it doesn't all, again, happen in the collective bargaining, where we see people in the audition process or the interview process being at risk, we actually started working on legislation. we realized that some of the laws were really gray areas for our members. And we wanted to make sure to do something to go and cement that. So we worked locally, we did federal on a state level and a federal level, and worked continuously to change laws. And I think that all of these things together have actually helped us to move forward. It's something that it's so important. Also, one of the things we created, which I think is the most important, is our reporting app. And the reason I think that it's so important is it actually gives voice to people who are afraid of retribution. It gives them a place to have somebody to talk to be able to have clarity. Do I want to do something with it now? If I don't, what kind of mental health support can I get? What kind of legal support? So by creating this app, we've actually given people a voice and a place to put and hold their information for them and to guide them. And then last but not least, because we see the sexually hyperexposed work in our industry, intimacy coordinators, which are a type of choreographer on the sets. There's only really about 40 professionals in over 500 shows that exist. So we started as an organization working with an accreditation process with the professional intimacy coordinators, creating something so that we can go and build that universe so that in the future, we'll have more and more professional intimacy coordinators who can help bring protections to the set, to our members, and to everybody else. And I think all of these things together will keep evolving, and we are informed by the work that's being shared here. We're informed by FIA, the Federation of International Actors, who are also journeying through this together. And I really believe that if we continue moving forward, we can go and truly make the systemic change that we all really hope for. So thank you for having me here.
Gabrielle, thank you so much. You really identified the engagement with the employer and lifted up the collective bargaining agreement, also talked about engagement with legislation and the idea of alternative mechanisms of problem solving because the individual may not quite be ready, which is multiple points of entry, taking that trauma-informed framework and that many of you had talked about and have really addressed in a way that sends a message of safety and care to the workforce. And so thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I have a question for folks on the panel. And if you want to raise your hand, I will recognize you in that order. How have all of you involved your members in efforts to address gender-based violence and harassment? And what are the strategies that you found most powerful to make sure the voices of workers are at the forefront of your strategies? Who'd like to take that on first? Tiffany.
Yeah, for us, when we're talking about the culture change curriculum that we have with Rise Up, and really I also like to talk about it as a movement. First of all, it was developed by and for the construction industry. So all of the scenarios, all the examples that we use, all of the ways to intervene, all came directly from folks who actually work in the construction industry here in Oregon. And then the second piece that we have is we have an ongoing trades worker equity council who is actually leading. They're sort of like the authoritative body over a group that we call Safe from Hate that is looking at how do we address this across the construction industry. And that group has ultimate power to make recommendations, to veto things that the rest of the group is suggesting, and to share their experiences in the industry. And so continuing to have those voices be a part of what our solutions are, to actively have their stories be a part of how we're addressing this is absolutely critical to making our program successful.
Rajanda. Thank you, Tiffany.
Well, we've had some roundtable discussions. We've had some prominent people in Chicago from different sectors come together to have a discussion about gender-based violence. And we invited our members, and that was very helpful for our members to understand that they are not alone and that this is a problem that is nationwide and that we are here to just empower each other. We've also sent some blast out through text messages, and we've tried to create a platform in which our members know that there is a safe space. And in addition to having the panic buttons and making sure that the hotels are training security as to how to respond if this panic button is pushed, all of these things we felt created an environment that would relax and ease tension on our mostly female housekeepers if they were ever in need of assistance.
Thank you so much, Rashonda. Gabrielle.
You know, everything we've done actually has been in conjunction with our members. I think that our truly, I believe, success comes not just from leadership making decisions, but doing it collaboratively. So we have a guidebook our members put together themselves based on what are the best practices when you're on set, something that really articulates the challenges that individuals face. We, in legislation, we bring members to speak who are survivors. We have them come and speak on these issues so that there's a real humanistic aspect to it. It's not just a story being told, but this is who's gone through it and what they experienced. With our ICs, we work with our members who have had the experience of working with intimacy coordinators, and a lot of the intimacy coordinators happen to be members as well. And we started to, with them together, we identified what are the most important things we need to have in place to make sure that this is a strong, strong profession. So I think that's the best thing for us is the communication has been the leader for us.
Gabrielle, I'm actually going to ask you a follow-up question about those intimacy coordinators. I know the Canadian labor movement has folks who get time off to do that kind of work. Do your intimacy coordinators through collective bargaining get time off to do that kind of work, or is that on volunteer time?
Intimacy coordinators is actually, it is a role that is paid for by the producers, our employers. We are actually, this is something we're creating so that we can't mandate it to be on set if you don't have enough of them. So we are creating, that's why we had the accreditation program. These are people who are actually paid to do this work. It is just like we have stunt coordinators, we actually have intimacy coordinators, and they are there solely to protect the performer in intimacy scenes, to talk about it. There's a 24-hour notice beforehand, so you know exactly what you're going to be doing. You have to approve it. It can't be changed. And they're there to help to make sure is the liaison between the director and the actor. But yes, it is a paid profession that we want to continue growing. We don't want it to be something that's just a part-time job. It really takes people who have strong therapeutic understanding. It's not just something you do to say, I've been on a set. There's real important practices when it comes to intimate work. What if you're doing a role of a pedophile? And how do you deal with that with a young person or the person who has to play it?
Right. Anyone else want to weigh in on this particular question? Yes.
I'll weigh in and just say, I've heard a little bit of the 4 things that we do: education, certification, advocacy, training. We have a large responsibility when you think about 300,000 plus members. They represent 115 million workers in this country. And so that's a huge responsibility. So for us, it's constant education. And even for people who are in the profession that aren't members, there is some content on our sites that are just available and free. So education is key. The next part, of course, certification. We have SHRM certification. And if you're SHRM certified, you're saying that you have undergone some training that allows you to be someone that can be held accountable for your actions in the workplace and creating a culture that works for all. Advocacy, we have a 17,000 member A team that really focuses on spending time with our state legislators as well as our federal legislators on key issues that are important to culture, workplace, as well as our 6 policy pillars, and then training. It is constant training. And now, of course, with technology, we're able to do webcasts and other things online, but people are hankering to get back in person. And so we even have an entire product, a whole inclusion conference. That's the name of the conference, Inclusion, that is completely focused on how you create these inclusive cultures, as well as our annual conference, which is much larger too. So those 4 things: education, certification, advocacy, and training.
Thank you so much. We are going to move into the question and answer period. We've gotten amazing questions, but Gabrielle, you wanted to say one more thing. I can see your hand up.
No, Oh, no,
Okay.
I didn't lower it. I apologize.
Okay, okay. So actually, the question about return on investment for employers, and Emily, this actually is a question for you.
Okay.
How do you convince employers that this is, how do you make a robust economic case for employers that gender-based violence and harassment policy is a good return on their investment?
Oh, that's easy. I think I talked to you earlier about the cost of acquisition, right?
Yes.
The cost to recruit and to onboard an employee, right? If you look at that cost, the cost of loss, once you lose an employee, and how you now are paying overtime in some instances to other employees, the cost of the relationships that may go with that employee. So look, it is the green, right? When you really think about it, it's the number one thing you can say across the board is that the cost to the organization, if you were to lose that worker, I don't even want to think about the subsequent litigation that could come out of that, right? So I'm just talking about the cost of doing business in general that you will incur if you don't create a workplace that is free of violence. And let me say this one piece. I know we're focusing on gender, but it's free of violence for all. You know, one of the things we've noted in some of our SHRM research is there's a lack of civility across the board in the workplace today. Heck, in the grocery store, we're just not as civil, and we've got to do a better job of bringing our civil selves to the workplace to create an environment that works for all. And if that employer is focusing on that, you've got great retention. You've got people who are invested in the business. They're becoming entrepreneurs as opposed to entrepreneurs where they are creating opportunities for the business. And so that's the ROI, that if you really invest in your people and their experience in the workplace, and you hold one another accountable, you have to hold, the employer should be holding employees accountable, but employees, you've got to, in a civil manner, hold your peers accountable when there is behavior that is absolutely unacceptable.
Thank you, Emily. Chidi, there's a question for you. Please join us again. Does C190 recognize a human right to be free from gender-based violence and harassment? Is it a fundamental principle and right at work?
Thank you. What a great question. I mean, the short answer to that is C190 most certainly does recognize a human right to be free of violence and harassment. This was a very intense discussion, actually, during the negotiations at the conference. So C190, first of all, recognizes, as mentioned earlier, the right of everyone to a world of work free of violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. But in relation to the specific question of a human right violation, it does say that violence and harassment in the world of work can constitute a human rights violation or abuse. And the reason for this was lots of back and forth discussions about whether, some relatively minor forms of violence and harassment, and please don't ask me what these might be or what these might look like, but, part of the question was if, there is something that is a relatively minor infraction, which is nonetheless caught by the definition of the terms under the convention, could these then be said to be a human rights violation? And that's why you have the language that recognizes quite clearly that it can indeed constitute a human rights violation. So the answer to that is yes, in my view. In relation to whether it's a fundamental principle, not at the moment. For those who might be wondering what that is, the ILO recognizes that there are certain fundamental principles and rights at work that apply regardless of whether a country, a member state, has ratified or signed one of its labor standards. There are 8 of these. I wouldn't rattle through them just for the sake of time, but give you an example: freedom of association, right to collective bargaining are part of these. The right to, gender equality and non-discrimination in employment and occupation. So the right to equality and non-discrimination, in fact, in employment and occupation, and the right to equal pay are part of the framework of fundamental standards. There is a discussion at the ILO at the moment to the effect that standards that address occupational safety and health should also be part of these standards, which does not automatically mean that C190 will become part of that framework, but of course C190 is very much part of this body of standards that approach the issue of occupational health and safety, recognizing that violence and harassment is indeed both a question of human rights, a question of equality, but also a question of occupational health and safety as well. So it's not a very clear cut answer to that, but it's the best that I can do at the moment.
It's really important to identify all of the important frameworks and contexts to understand it in the way that you've beautifully described. Here are two questions that are related, and I'll do them together. C190 recognizes the impact of domestic violence on workers while they are at work. How have you addressed this issue? And then a follow-up to that is, what are the best ways to encourage those who have been sexually harassed or experienced domestic violence, encouraged to come forward? And you can answer both or whichever part of the question, but I thought that they were really beautifully related. Who would like to start?
I'll start.
Thank you, Roshanda.
First of all, I think listening with an empathetic ear is very important. When you're having conversations, you should be speaking to your members, your coworkers as to the outcome. What coming forward, what would you like the outcome to be? Do you want to talk to management? Put yourself in a position that you're going to walk this walk with your coworker. I think that's important. And I think that once you promote yourself as the person who is going to help carry this burden, I think that that will create an environment where more people will come forward.
Thank you, Roshanda. That is beautiful in identifying the empathy, that trauma-informed lens, the framework for trust and building trust. Other folks have any experiences? Tiffany, yes.
I think also, related to that, when you end up walking through with someone, it's also really important to ensure that from like the company perspective, from the employer perspective, that there's a communication happening back to the folks who were either targeted or who reported the incident. Because if you're actually doing something about it, if you're taking responsibility and saying, we're going to address this thing, and you have policies that are in place, but then you don't actually communicate that with anyone, the workers don't know that they can trust you. They don't know what those outcomes are going to look like. They don't understand those consequences. And so it's like a balance of doing that, while respecting confidentiality, but making sure that folks feel like, I didn't just come and tell you something and then I never heard from you again. So that's a big piece that we talk through with folks, is that there has to be that follow-up and that ongoing communication, which is a part, I think, of the trust and respect and empathy too. Like, what does it feel like to be hanging on the other end and feel like this, and to know that this really horrible thing has happened to you, and then not to know what's happening if you did, decide to address it in a formal way.
And Tiffany, I think what's so beautiful and important about what you identified is not only that individual follow-up, respecting confidentiality with the individual, but the education and the proactive, preventive initiative where you let people know that they're not going to be in triple jeopardy, meaning to be victimized, worry about their job jeopardy, and then afraid to bring it forward to the union, so that you're opening the door in that way to really engage everyone in that awareness that this is an issue that the union and the employer take seriously, in the way in which the panic button strategy was discussed, and ways that Gabrielle talked about the intimacy scene collaboration, engaging men as allies.
That's incredibly important.
can you talk a little bit about that? When we look at this framework, C190 looks at gender in the broad frame, gender identity, expression, LGBTQI+, men as well as women. Gabrielle, you've got
First of
the
all, oh, thank you. I think it's really important because we're talking about it predominantly being women, but it really is everybody. And it's not only the person who is sexually assaulted, but sometimes it's the person who witnesses it, right? So there's many levels to this being a very painful and complicated issue, but men are definitely a part of the team. And when we first started out on this process of really being out there in the public, and people kept, saying we have to get together with women's groups and all these things, and it's not, the men are not our enemies. We're humanity. And there are people who do things that are so inappropriate that everybody gets labeled under that. And that's a mistake for us. It will take all of us to make true systemic change. It will take education for all of us to be able to own it and to say where we can be better. And I have found some of our greatest allies coming from men who are there to say, this is absolutely unacceptable, and I stand with you. And if we can be proud enough to and courageous enough to include everybody, we really will make true change. I think if we hold it only to ourselves, then we fail. And so thank you for bringing that up, because the victimization comes in many different people in many different ways, but we can together really work through it.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? One last question before we wrap up. And remember, this is just the beginning of our dialogue. This was so rich and inspiring. One last question. What are some of the best strategies for dealing with gender-based violence and harassment when there's no traditional employment relationship? For example, freelancers or those who are classified as independent contractors. And I know in certain industries, it's much more prominent than others. Who would like to take this question? Go for it, Gabrielle.
Just do the top part of that question, because we are independent contractors, and that's where we actually deal with legislation, because we need to make sure there are gray points for members who are freelance, or even if they're employed by an employer or they're freelance with you, however you want to say it, there's a gray area where we saw it particularly for the interview or audition process. Again, we're not seen as employees at that moment. And yet we needed to make sure in that place of power where somebody who you're interviewing with or meeting, a Harvey Weinstein, who's a producer, a writer, whatever it is, that in that moment you have as many protections as you do once you're at the job site, right? Because the risk, that gray matter there with those laws actually created issues. So that's where we've been working, again, on a state level and federal level. You're hearing the laws that are being passed, but it is difficult because the way the laws have been set up here in the United States to be able to identify somebody who's freelance as having a voice prior to their work moment. And because our work is different and we're exposed early on, we needed to find ways to attack that outside of the collective bargaining.
Thank you. Chidi.
Thank you. And absolutely, would echo what Gabrielle has just described, but perhaps just add a reminder that, from the C190 perspective as well, pretty much everybody has a responsibility for preventing and addressing violence and harassment in the world of work. So there are things that the government can do, for instance, first of all, to raise awareness. That's a critically important role, but also to make sure that there's adequate access to justice. And whilst, access to justice occurs after the harm has occurred, it can also make people think twice about, committing the harm in the first place. So again, making sure that, justice systems are adequately set up and equipped to enable those who perhaps don't have a direct employment relationship, don't have procedures in a more formal workplace that they can use to raise grievances, etc., can actually access courts and tribunals easily, accessibly, and not to, an extortionate cost. to have that redress. I think that can also be a preventative measure. And then, of course, the role of labor inspectorates, inspecting those places where people may go in to work, even if they're not employees of that place, to make sure that there are proper precautions and measures that have been taken to prevent violence and harassment.
Thank you so much, Judy. And this is a perfect segue as we wrap up. And I want to just emphasize a number of key points. As Kevin mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, the ILO wants to know which issues you want to continue to work on so that it can support discussion groups. The richness of our discussions really spoke to the ongoing dialogue and discussion and the interchange of ideas. So now we're sending out a very quick poll to take your pulse on how we can help with sustained efforts to address gender-based violence and harassment by listing some of the topics to pursue further. So the poll is right on your screen. If you wouldn't mind looking at it and registering your answer, you can check as many as possible. And I just want to mention that if we haven't listed the issue you're most interested in, you can email the ILO, and the address is in the poll, but I'll just say it out loud. It's Washington, small w, at ILO.org. We'll follow up after the webinar with more information about potential salons, which are discussion groups and gatherings bringing together interested colleagues around particular issues so that we can support greater dialogue and action. And finally, I want to send a huge, heartfelt, inspired thank you to our fabulous speakers, panelists, to our wonderful audience for all of your thoughtfulness, your questions, and for the commitment for this social dialogue that is integral to moving culture change forward. A video recording of this presentation will appear on ILO's website and LinkedIn page. And happy day after International Women's Day.